Hi, BookTube. I'm Mike Frost, the self-entitled, self-aggrandizing postmodernist poetry prognosticator. I am new to YouTube, and I just completed the BookTube Newbie Tag. And shortly after doing that, Adrian over at Strip Cover Lit, who, if you don't know, you need to know, tagged me with a Poetrytube Newbie Tag. Well, I have to do that. So he sent over 11 questions. And if you haven't seen the tag, please join Adrian over at Strip Covered Lit and take a look at it. But here I can be a little bit more brief, stick strictly to the questions because I've already introduced myself to BookTube through the BookTube Newbie Tag. So I'll just stick strictly with the questions. And he sends over 11, the first one being, do you read and write poetry or do you just read it? I do both. But as I explained in the BookTube Newbie Tag, I do not want my site to be seen as an author tag or an author site. So if I do an author site, it'll be something completely different. With this, I want to stick with my enjoyment of reading poetry and sharing poetry. So I won't discuss what I do write as poetry, but I do read a lot of poetry, but I also write it. Who is your favorite poet is question number 2. And that's easy for me. That's Shakespeare. I do include his plays, the excerpts from his plays as poetry. So when you include the entire body of his writing, his poetry, he's my favorite. I could stay with him. If I were lost on a desert island, that'd be the one I'd take with me. It's the complete works of Shakespeare. So Shakespeare is my favorite poet. What is the one question you would ask your favorite poet? Who did you write those sonnets to? Would be the question. I really need to know who he wrote the sonnets to. And that's one of the great literary mysteries that I would love to be able to solve by meeting Shakespeare. I would not presume, as Hitchens and Adrian's original video, I would not presume to go to heaven and meet Shakespeare. But if I did, I don't think I'd be disappointed, and I don't think I'd be overwhelmed by Shakespeare. I think of him as a very human person. So not too worried about that, but I would really like to know who he wrote those sonnets to. Anybody know? Okay, moving on. Favorite poem. Now this I covered at length in my BookTube Newbie Tag. It's Unto My Own by Robert Frost. So I won't recite it here again, and I won't go into it too much, except to say that if you hadn't watched that one, it was recited to me by my 7th grade English teacher, Mr. G, and notice Mr. G, who was very important to my development and my love of stories, my love of poetry. His voice still is in my head. I can still hear him. He was very important to me. And one day, whilst I was daydreaming away, he recited that poem to me. And it was the first poem that really got me. It was like it reflected who I was. And it meant the world to me at the time. And it never left me. So that poem, because of the personal connection I have with that poem and my favorite teacher, that's my favorite poem. What is your favorite poem to read aloud? Now, this may be a rather strange answer, but it's Robert Burns' My Love. And everybody seems to be reading it aloud. So I will actually read, I'll take it from the book and I will read it, although I can recite it. Oh, my love is like a red, red rose that's newly sprung in June. Oh, my love is like a melody that's sweetly played in tune. As fair thou art, my bonny lass, so deep in love am I. And I will love thee still, my dear, to the seas gone dry. Till all the seas gone dry, my dear, and the rocks melt with the sun. And I will love thee still, my dear, to the sands of life shall run. And fare thee well, my bonny lass, so fare thee well a while, and I will come again, my love, though it were 10,000 mile. Now, Robert Barnes is a great poet. I do enjoy him. He's not my favorite poet, but he's a good poet. And that's a good poem. Not a great poem, but it's a good poem. So why is it my favorite to recite aloud? It's my wife's favorite poem. She likes to hear it. And I dare say that all our children owe their very existence to the recitation of that poem. I'll leave it there for you, BookTube. Who is your Mount Rushmore of poetry is his question number 6. So he asked us not to equivocate on these, but here I am going to. So I have a Mount Rushmore, if you wanted to name 4 of your top poets, the ones that you come back to time and time again. I have those. That's Shakespeare, obviously being my favorite, and you could read him. You could take a lifetime reading Shakespeare. Tennyson. I love me some Tennyson. Yeats is someone that I can, because of the growth of Yeats through his career, and he just keeps getting better as he ages with his poetry. I could read him time and time again. And Pablo Neruda, one of my favorite poets, and an extremely important poet. And the body of his work is amazing. So Pablo Neruda would be part of that Mount Rushmore of the general poets. But if you're speaking of Mount Rushmore as an American monument, who is your American poets? It's a little bit more difficult for me to narrow down because you got Whitman and Longfellow. These are great poets, but for me, if it's my Mount Rushmore, so if I'm putting up and I'm coming back to admire their poetry again and again, well, Frost is there, obviously. Emily Dickinson up there. Langston Hughes and Maya Angelou would be those 4 would be my top 4 American poets that I could come back to again and again and admire the artistic work and them. So, yeah, those would be my American Mount Rushmore if I could give 2 answers to one question, if that's fair. I don't know. I'll leave it there and let you decide. What is your favorite poetry collection? Well, I don't have I do have many favorite poetry collections, but here I am going to go with an anthology. And this old, beat up anthology is my favorite by far, not because it's all-inclusive or it does anything more than it's the Treasury of Great Poems, English and American. I don't know if you can see that. It's falling apart. But this book I got shortly after joining the service, and it has traveled with me in my career. It has seen Paris, London, Madrid, Rome, Istanbul. It's weathered sandstorms in the Saudi desert, seen the pyramids of both the Incas and the Egyptians. It has gone Central America, South America, from one side of the states to the other. Keeps complaining to me that I haven't brought it to the Far East, but I'll get it there. But this old beat-up anthology is a traveling companion and a dear friend of mine. So if I had to pick my favorite collection, although it's an anthology, not really a collection, my dear friend is coming with me wherever I go. So the rest of the questions are basically about poetry. It's number 8 would be rhyming. Talk about it. Yes, no, anymore? Definitely. There's no aspect of poetry that cannot still be used and used well. As long as Dana Goya and the new formalists are still writing, there's a place for rhyme, there's a place for meter, there's a place for, not with just Dana, but anything that wants to be used, as long as it's used well. Every element of poetry that's ever existed is still welcomed into the canon. It's just a matter of using it well. And there are many poets still writing today that use rhyme, meter, forms, all of this well. So as long as they're using it well, you got my vote. Let's see, 9. Barring free verse, what is your favorite poetic form? Wow, I'm a big fan of the villanelle, the sonnet, but I think the haiku. Right now, I am really enjoying what I'm seeing coming out of a new form called the Fibonacci. Over at Muse Pie Press, there's a Fib review, and the Fibonacci follows the Fibonacci sequence, so it's a mathematical type sequence. And what I see it as, because I'm a huge fan of the haiku and the renga, is this is the scientific equivalent to the nature poem of the haiku. Now, the haiku has been expanded well beyond its original having to have something to do with nature or the 5 seasons that it originally covers. But it was at its origins a poetry that had to have at least a mention of a season, and it was often equated with nature poems. It's expanded well beyond that. But the Fibonacci, being it's in the Fibonacci sequence, to me, is its scientific equivalent. So when I see a lot of Fibonacci poems that have nothing to do with science, but when I do see one that has to do with science, it's like it's form meets function, and I'm fascinated by that, and I think there's a new form in poetry. The Fibonacci has my attention right now. So we'll see what comes of the Fibonacci over there at the Fib Review and Muse Pie Press. And there's other people that are publishing Fibonacci poetry, but that's where I can go to get a good sampling of what's being written now. Humor in poetry or no? Of course you got to have humor in poetry. You can't eliminate anything from poetry, neither form nor function. A poet will find a way to make it work, a good poet. So humor, like any form or rhyming or any element of poetry, is always welcome when it's done well. What elements do you think contribute to the best poetry? And that's his final question, and it's a good one. To end on that note is something. So for me, when I read poetry, some of the things that just jump out at me and make me enjoy and treasure a poem as I'm reading it is a sense of history of poetry. Now, being someone that's read a lot of poetry and read a lot of historical poetry and continues to read a lot of poetry, I do that because I see this as one large conversation. Poets and poetry is a conversation. And to ignore your elders, if you will, I think is a mistake. I think when people acknowledge what has come before them and understand, even if they're going to violate the rules, if you are going to write on a haiku, but not do a season reference or a nature, but you understand that's where it came from, that as long as the poet and poem reflect the understanding of the history of not just world history or cultural history, but the history of your own poetics, to me that reaches out and grabs me about poetry. Not every poem has to be, I guess, if you take it too far, you end up in meta poem, a poem about poetry, which is not what I'm speaking of here. Doesn't necessarily have to be a poem about poetry or a poem about poems. That would be considered a meta poem. But as long as it reflects the knowledge of what poetry has been, that's one element that just, you get me every time. The other element that I would put into one word is words. For a poet, I think, an understanding of the words you're using is extremely important. The history of the word, the etymology of the word, the sound of the word, the sense of the word. A poet that uses words well will always find a way to write a good, if not great, poem. So if I'm going to keep it this short, those are the two elements that I would say: a sense of the history of poetry and poems, and knowledge of words. That's the tools. So you got to have the knowledge of words. Those are my two things. And that is the Poetrytube Newbie Tag. Thank you, Adrian and Strip Covered Lit. And thank you all that have listened to my other videos and enjoyed this one. So I hope to see you again soon, BookTube.